The coastal town had always been quiet, peaceful, and predictable. People knew each other by name, doors stayed unlocked during the day, and children rode their bicycles without fear. But beneath this calm life was a growing worry that only the older residents seemed to notice. One of them was Eleanor Price, a woman in her late 60s who had lived in the town since she was a teenager. She had seen the cliffs change, the coastline shrank, and the once wide road begin to crumble year after year. To her the danger was obvious, but to others it was just another part of the landscape. Every morning Eleanor walked her dog along the cliffside path. She was not an expert, but anyone with eyes could see the changes. The ground seemed softer, the cracks deeper, the edge closer than it used to be. Sometimes when she placed her foot too close to the rim, tiny stones rolled down into the ocean. That sound, small pebbles falling and disappearing, gave her a strange chill. It was like the earth was warning them, whispering that something was wrong. One day, after a night of heavy rain, she saw a new crack stretching across the road, long and dark like a fresh wound. Her heart tightened. The crack wasn't small anymore, it crossed almost the entire width of the cliff road. If a car passed over it at the wrong moment, the whole section could break away. She took pictures on her old phone, her hands shaking. She knew she had to tell someone again, even though she had already tried many times before. The local council office was a simple building near the town center. Eleanor walked in with her photos, expecting at least concern. Instead, she found two busy clerks and a manager who looked tired before the day even started. When she explained the problem, showing her photos and describing the sounds of shifting rocks, they said the same thing she had heard for 2 years. "We are aware of the issue, Mrs. Price. The repair work is on our list, on your list," she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "This road could collapse. Someone could get hurt." The manager smiled politely, the kind of smile that meant he wanted the conversation to end quickly. "We understand your concern, but the tourist season is coming. Closing the road would cause unnecessary panic. We'll handle it when funds are available." Eleanor left the office more frustrated than before. She had lived long enough to know when people were not listening. She also knew that the council cared more about tourists' money than safety. The cliffside road led to a viewpoint that visitors loved, and closing it would mean fewer people stopping by the restaurants and gift shops. To the council, money was louder than warnings. Still, Eleanor did not give up. She printed flyers, talked to neighbors, and spoke during community meetings. Some residents agreed with her, especially those who walked near the cliff often. They too had noticed the cracks and shifting soil, but most people shrugged it off. "Nothing has happened yet," they would say. "The cliffs have always been like this." It was strange how people needed something terrible to happen before they believed danger existed. But the cliffs had not always been this unstable. Over the years, storms had become stronger, waves had eaten away at the base, and the rock had become weaker. The town had seen this with their own eyes, yet they convinced themselves things were normal because it was easier than worrying. People liked comfort. They liked routine. When someone like Eleanor warned them, they treated her like she was exaggerating or overthinking. One afternoon, Eleanor invited a retired engineer named Thomas who had moved to the town recently. He examined the cliff carefully. After an hour, he said, "This isn't safe at all. These cracks show active movement. The whole section could fall with the right pressure." He agreed to speak at the next community meeting. Eleanor felt a little hope. The meeting room was full that evening. People chatted casually, unaware of the seriousness of what was coming. When it was Eleanor's turn, she stepped forward and explained everything again. She then invited Thomas to share his findings. He spoke calmly, using simple words so everyone could understand. But instead of concern, many people seemed annoyed. Some rolled their eyes. Others whispered that he was new here and didn't understand the town. When the council members responded, they said the same empty lines. "We will review the situation. We must consider our budget. Let's not create fear without reason." Their voices were smooth, practiced, and dismissive. Eleanor realized they were trying to avoid responsibility. If they admitted the road was dangerous, they would be forced to close it. And if they closed it, business owners would complain. They wanted silence, not solutions. After the meeting, a few residents approached Eleanor quietly. They thanked her, said she was brave, and admitted they also worried about the cliff. But when she asked if they would join her in demanding action, they looked away. "We don't want trouble," they said softly. Fear of conflict kept them silent. Days turned into weeks. The crack grew wider. Heavy trucks still used the road. Tourists stopped their cars to take photos at the edge, unaware they stood on a fragile structure. Each time Eleanor watched cars pass, her stomach tightened. She felt like she was watching people walk across thin ice. Some evenings she sat by her window, staring at the dark silhouette of the cliff. She wondered how people could ignore something so clear. She wondered why warnings only mattered after it was too late. She also wondered how she would live with herself if something happened and she had been unable to stop it. At times she felt tired, almost ready to give up. But then she would remember the crack, the shifting stones, and that strange sound of pebbles falling into the sea. She knew giving up wasn't an option. She couldn't close the road herself, but she could keep speaking, keep reminding, keep pushing. Even if people called her dramatic or stubborn, She preferred that to being silent while danger grew under their feet still. The truth gnawed at her. The council was not listening. The people in charge were pretending everything was fine. They offered polite smiles, empty promises, and excuses disguised as explanations. They treated warnings as noise rather than guidance. And that was the problem. Humans often think they have time. They think disasters happen in stories, not real life. They ignore signs, believing nothing bad will happen to them. But nature doesn't care about convenience or confidence. The cliff was changing every day. And it didn't care about tourist seasons or council meetings. Eleanor sensed that something was coming. She could feel it, like a heavy cloud settling over the town. She hoped desperately that the council would act before the worst happened. But deep down, she feared that her warnings would only be heard after they turned into tragedy, and in that quiet coastal town, while everyone carried on with their routines, the cliff continued to crumble slowly, silently, and dangerously right beneath their feet. The weeks that followed felt heavier for everyone in the town, even though most people pretended everything was normal. The weather had started changing in a way that made the sea look wild and restless. Strong winds came more often, carrying the smell of salt and danger. Each storm seemed to shake the cliffs a little more, making the cracks spread like veins under the surface. Anyone who looked closely could see the damage growing, but most people avoided looking at all. It was easier to ignore something frightening than accept that it might destroy their peaceful routine. Eleanor, however, could not ignore it. Every morning she walked to the cliffside road with her notebook and old phone. She took pictures of the cracks, measured how long they had become, and wrote down her observations. Some days she knelt on the ground to touch the edges of the cracks, feeling how the soil had turned loose, almost crumbly. She imagined the cliff as a tired old giant, slowly giving up after years of holding on. One morning, after a particularly violent storm, she saw something that made her heart skip. A whole section of the cliff edge had sunk slightly, just a few inches, but enough to show that the ground was shifting. If the sunken part decided to break away, the road above it would fall too. She leaned forward carefully and saw fresh debris scattered down the slope, showing that a small piece had already broken off during the night. Her concern grew stronger. She called the council again, her voice urgent. "Please come see it yourself," she begged. "It's much worse than before." The clerk on the phone responded in the same dull, rehearsed tone. "We appreciate your report, Mrs. Price. We'll add it to our record, record." Eleanor repeated angrily, "You don't need a record, you need action." But the clerk simply said, "We're doing everything we can." Before hanging up, Eleanor sat down at her kitchen table afterward, feeling a mix of fear and helplessness. She wondered what it would take for the council to understand the seriousness. How many signs did they need? Why could she see what they refused to see? She wasn't an expert, but she had lived next to the cliffs her whole life. She knew their moods better than anyone. A few days later, she stood near the road again when she noticed a young man taking pictures with a large camera. He introduced himself as Ryan, a photography student visiting from another town. He said he loved capturing dramatic landscapes. When he saw how worried she looked, he asked if something was wrong. She pointed at the cracks and the sunken section. "This road is dangerous. It might collapse soon." Ryan knelt down, studying the ground carefully. "You're right," he said softly. "This isn't normal erosion. This is active movement." He offered to share his photos with her in case she wanted to use them as proof. His kindness gave her a small boost of hope. Maybe if enough people noticed, the council would be forced to listen. Later that week, she visited her neighbor, Mrs. Harper, who lived closer to the edge than anyone else. The old woman was sitting on her porch with a cup of tea, watching the sea. "Did you feel the shaking last night?" Eleanor asked. Mrs. Harper nodded. "I thought it was thunder at first, but the ground trembled. Something fell too. I heard it slide down." "That's the cliff giving way," Eleanor said quietly. Mrs. Harper's face turned tense. "Do you think the road will collapse?" "I think it's only a matter of time." They sat together in silence, listening to the ocean. It wasn't the peaceful sound they were used to. It sounded rough, angry, like waves were pulling at the land with force. Over the next few days, more people began noticing strange things. A few drivers reported feeling a small jolt when their cars crossed a certain part of the road. A mother told Eleanor that her son refused to play near the cliff anymore because it made strange noises. Even the fishermen at the docks started talking about how the waves were hitting the rocks differently. These small signs made the whole town uneasy, but the council still did nothing. They held a meeting where they smiled confidently and said the situation was under control. They claimed the cracks were surface level and the road was safe. Behind their smiles, however, some residents could sense uncertainty, maybe even fear, but no one challenged them strongly enough. One evening, Thomas, the retired engineer, returned to visit Eleanor. He looked more serious this time. "I've been studying similar cases," he told her. "This type of cracking usually means the support under the cliff is hollowing out. Once enough weight presses down, the entire section could drop at once, so it could happen any day." Eleanor asked. Thomas nodded. "Any day, any hour, or maybe a sudden trigger like rain, a heavy truck, or even strong wind." His words made her stomach twist. She imagined tourists walking along the edge, families taking photos, cars driving casually over a road that could vanish beneath them. She felt a cold helplessness settle over her. She was trying so hard to prevent something terrible, but her voice alone could not shake the stubbornness of those in power. As the days passed, the storms grew worse. It seemed like the sky itself was trying to warn the town. Rain hammered the cliffside, loosening the soil even more. The ocean waves, stronger than ever, smashed against the base of the cliff, stealing more pieces of rock with every strike. The ground felt unstable, almost alive, breathing and shifting beneath the feet of anyone who dared walk too close. Tourists, however, continued to come. They didn't understand the danger. They saw only a beautiful view. They parked their cars near the edge, laughing, taking pictures, leaning over the barrier to get the perfect shot. Eleanor would rush toward them, waving her hands and shouting, "Move back, it's dangerous. Please stay away from the edge." Some listened. Others just smiled politely, thinking she was just an overprotective local. One couple even told her if it was really dangerous, the road would be closed. Right? Those words hurt her more than they intended. Yes, the road should have been closed, but the people with the power to close it were ignoring the truth. One night, heavy rain poured non-stop, louder than any storm in recent months. Thunder cracked above the cliffs and lightning illuminated the sky. Eleanor couldn't sleep. She sat on her couch, watching the storm through her window, her heart beating fast. Something felt wrong. She felt it deep inside, like an instinct that wouldn't let her rest. At sunrise, she rushed to the cliffside road. The storm had passed, but the damage was clear. The cracks had widened so much that she could fit her hand into one of them. Part of the barrier had fallen away, broken into pieces. The sunken section had dropped even lower, making the surface uneven and dangerous. She took dozens of photos and videos, then immediately marched to the council office. She demanded to see the officials. When they met her, she placed the photos on their desk. "This can't be ignored anymore," she said firmly. "Do you want people to die before you act?" The officials looked at the photos, their expressions troubled. But then one of them said softly, "We understand, but we cannot close the road without proper approval. The tourism board is concerned about the economic impact." Eleanor stared at them in disbelief. Economic impact? What about human lives? But her words were like stones thrown into an ocean, heard for a moment, then swallowed by silence. She walked out angry and heartbroken. She felt like she was fighting a battle alone, even though the danger was right in front of everyone. As she reached the cliff again, she saw more people gathered near the cracks, whispering among themselves. Some looked worried, some looked confused, and some looked like they had finally started to understand the seriousness. But for Eleanor it was too slow. The danger was growing too quickly, and the council was moving too slowly. The cliff was weakening day by day, and the town was running out of time. Everyone could feel it now, even if they didn't want to admit it. Something terrible was coming, and the warning signs were louder than ever. But the people in power weren't listening, and nature doesn't wait for permission. The day the disaster finally arrived began like any ordinary rainy afternoon, the kind the town had grown used to. Dark clouds hung low over the ocean, and the wind carried sharp bursts of cold air. The sea was rough, crashing hard against the rocks below the cliff. Most residents stayed indoors, thinking it was just another storm, not knowing that within hours their lives would be shaken forever. Eleanor woke up with a strange heaviness in her chest. She couldn't explain it, but something felt wrong, terribly wrong. She tried to distract herself by making tea, but her hands trembled. She kept glancing out the window toward the cliff, as if something was calling her. After several minutes of pacing, she grabbed her raincoat and stepped outside, her heart pounding. As she walked toward the cliffside road, the wind whipped her hair and rain stung her face. The path was muddy, and the ground felt softer than usual. She could feel it shifting slightly under her steps. She hurried, feeling a rising sense of urgency. When she reached the road, her breath caught. The crack she had been monitoring for weeks was now twice as wide as before. The sunken section had dropped even lower, making the surface tilt dangerously. She crouched and touched the earth. It wasn't just unstable, it was breathing, moving slowly, almost pulsing with pressure building underneath. She took out her phone and began recording, speaking quickly and shakily. "This road will collapse soon. Anyone driving here is in danger. Please, if anyone sees this, stay away from the cliff." She tried sending the video to the council, the local community groups, anyone who might act, but at that moment, the signal was weak due to the storm. The video failed to send. Frustrated, she decided to stand near the road and warn anyone who passed. She didn't know if anyone would listen, but she had to try. Minutes later, she saw the headlights of an approaching car. Her heart raced. A blue SUV was heading straight toward the most unstable part of the road. She rushed into the middle of the road, waving frantically. The driver slowed down, confused. "Turn around," she shouted through the rain. "The road is collapsing." The driver rolled down his window halfway. "Ma'am, are you sure?" "The council didn't say please. I'm begging you," Eleanor cried. "It's not safe. Go back." The driver hesitated but saw the fear in her eyes. Finally, he nodded and turned his SUV around. Eleanor watched him drive away, relief washing over her, but that relief lasted only a moment because she heard another sound, one that froze her blood. It was a deep, groaning noise, like the earth itself was being torn apart from the inside. She stepped backward instinctively. The ground trembled beneath her feet. Birds burst into the sky, screeching. The wind fell silent for a split second, as if holding its breath. Then came a blast of noise so loud it felt like the world cracked open. A huge portion of the cliffside dropped suddenly, like an elevator plunging without warning. The road shattered along the crack, splitting apart with incredible force. Chunks of asphalt flew into the air. Mud, rock, and debris tumbled downward in a roaring avalanche. A scream filled the air, not Ellie, but someone else's. She spun around and saw another car, a small silver sedan, already halfway across the failing section. The driver had not seen the danger in time. Tires screeched as he tried to stop, but the ground beneath him was already giving way. "Stop! Reverse, reverse!" Eleanor yelled, but her voice was drowned by the thunderous collapse. The sedan tilted sharply as one side of the road dropped. The rear tires lifted off the ground. The driver's terrified face pressed against the windshield. Eleanor ran toward the car without thinking, rain pounding her, mud splashing up her legs. She reached the edge just as the car slid forward. The driver's hand reached out for her, eyes wide with desperation. "I can't hold on," he shouted. "Give me your hand," Eleanor cried, but she was too late. The ground beneath the car crumbled, and the entire vehicle plunged into the churning sea below, swallowed by waves and disappearing in seconds. Eleanor screamed, her voice ripped apart by the wind. She fell to her knees, gripping the mud, staring helplessly into the swirling water. The collapse continued, tearing away more of the cliff. Trees, soil, rocks, all falling like a slow, dreadful waterfall. It felt surreal, like watching a nightmare unfold in real life. The ocean below foamed violently, filled with debris. Within minutes, the beautiful viewpoint road the town had once been proud of was gone, completely erased, as if it had never existed. Eleanor sat there shaking, rain soaking her clothes, her heart breaking. She had known this would happen. She had warned everyone. She had begged the council, begged the community, begged anyone who would listen. But it didn't matter. Her voice had never been enough to stop this moment. And now a man was gone because of it. By the time emergency sirens echoed through the town, the storm had quieted slightly, but the destruction was clear. Fire trucks, ambulances, and police cars lined the road. Officers held everyone back, shouting for people to stay away from the unstable ground. A crowd formed quickly, neighbors, tourists, business owners, all staring in shock at the massive gap where the road had once been. Some people gasped, others cried. A few fell silent with guilt written across their faces. Eleanor sat wrapped in a blanket that a paramedic had given her, but she barely felt it. She couldn't stop replaying the moment in her head, the man's hand reaching out, his voice, the scream, the fall. A police officer approached her gently. "Ma'am, you tried to warn him, didn't you?" She nodded weakly. "I tried to warn all of you," she whispered, tears mixing with rain on her cheeks. "For months." The officer looked down, shame filling his eyes. Nearby, the council members arrived. Their faces were pale, shaken, as they stared at the collapse. One of them whispered, "My God, this is worse than any of us expected." Eleanor turned toward them slowly, her eyes blazing with grief and anger. "You expected this," she said hoarsely. "I told you, I showed you, and you did nothing." The officials looked guilty but speechless. There was nothing they could say that would undo what had happened. As rescue teams searched the waters below, people in the crowd whispered among themselves. "She warned them, she said this would happen. Why didn't they listen?" Regret spread across the town like a cold storm of its own. But regret couldn't bring back the man who had fallen. It couldn't rebuild the road. It couldn't undo the pain tearing through Eleanor's heart. Standing at the edge of the broken cliff, she felt the final weight of what she had feared for months. The warning had been ignored. The danger had been real. And the devastating price had finally arrived. The town would never forget this day, because the cliff had taken more than land. It had taken trust, safety, and a human life. And for Eleanor, this disaster was not a surprise. It was the tragedy she had seen coming all along. The hours after the collapse felt unreal, like the whole town had been dropped into a dark dream that no one knew how to wake up from. The storm clouds were still hanging in the sky, but the rain had slowed, leaving behind a heavy, confused silence. People moved around quietly, whispering to each other as if speaking loudly might break whatever fragile sense of control they still had left. The sirens faded, the emergency workers spread out, and slowly everyone began to understand the truth. The disaster wasn't just a cliff falling. It was trust collapsing. The rescue teams worked for hours, searching the water for the man in the silver car. The ocean was rough and full of debris, making it nearly impossible to find anything. Still, they tried again and again, diving into the freezing water, shining lights along the shore, calling out. Eleanor stood nearby, her arms wrapped around herself. She could still hear the man's voice, still see his hand reaching toward her. It replayed like a loop she couldn't stop. By the time the rescue efforts were paused for safety, A crowd of townspeople had gathered. Some were crying, some stood stone-faced, others kept shaking their heads, whispering things like, "How could this happen?" And someone should have done something. The guilt and fear was spreading fast, settling into the town like a thick fog. Not long after, the council members arrived one by one. Their steps were slow, uncertain. Their faces were pale as they stared at the giant wound carved into the earth where the road had once been. They tried to stay calm in front of the crowd, but the truth was written across their expressions. They were terrified, not just of what had happened, but of the consequences standing right in front of them. One of the councilmen, Mr. Davenport, tried to speak to the crowd. His voice trembled. "This is a terrible and unexpected tragedy." "We are unexpected," someone shouted from the back. "You were warned." Another voice joined in. "Eleanor told you. She begged you." People turned toward her. Eleanor stood frozen, unsure whether the attention felt comforting or painful. A young man stepped forward, shaking with anger. "You ignored her. You ignored all of us. Now someone is dead because you didn't want to lose tourist money." The council members exchanged worried looks. For the first time, their rehearsed, confident expressions cracked. They could no longer pretend they were in control. They couldn't hide behind polite smiles or empty promises anymore. Mr. Davenport lifted his hands, trying to calm everyone. "We understand your frustration. We truly do, but we cannot jump to conclusions. The storm didn't cause this," Thomas interrupted sharply. The retired engineer stepped into the circle, rain still dripping from his coat. "The cliff has been eroding for years. The signs were clear. Eleanor showed you the photos. I spoke during your meeting. You did nothing." A wave of murmurs spread through the crowd. People nodded, whispering their agreement. The pressure grew, pushing the officials into an uncomfortable corner. Eleanor finally stepped forward, her voice quiet but strong. "I didn't want this to happen. I tried so many times. I tried to save someone, but I couldn't." The crowd fell silent. Even the officials looked at her with a mix of shame and regret. One of the councilwomen, Mrs. Green, stepped closer to Eleanor. "Mrs. Price, we never thought." "That's the problem," Eleanor said sharply. "You never thought. You just assumed everything would stay the same. You ignored the danger because you didn't want to deal with it. And now someone is gone." The council members lowered their heads. They knew she was right. As the evening continued, reporters from nearby towns arrived. Cameras flashed. Microphones were held out. People shared what they had seen, what they had warned, what they feared. The collapse was no longer just a local issue. It became news. Spreading beyond the small coastal town, the officials struggled to answer questions. Every answer made them look more careless, more disconnected from the truth. "We didn't receive enough evidence," they said. "We were planning repairs," they added. "We didn't think the situation was this serious," they repeated. But the townspeople countered every excuse with memories of warnings, photos, meetings, and pleas. The truth was unfolding like a painful, undeniable story. Later that night, a temporary barrier was placed around the collapsed area to prevent anyone from falling in. Police officers stood guard. The waves below continued to crash, mixing with the last pieces of debris floating in the water. The ocean looked angry, as though it was reminding everyone that nature cannot be ignored. Families gathered in small groups, comforting each other. Some hugged, some cried silently. Many of them kept glancing at the council members, whose presence felt like an unwanted reminder of failure. In the middle of all this, Eleanor sat on a bench under a screen. She felt drained, emotionally and physically. She had spent months trying to keep people safe. Now she watched the consequence of being ignored. She didn't feel triumphant or vindicated. She felt broken. Thomas sat beside her. "You did everything you could," he said gently. "But it wasn't enough," she whispered. "You're one person," he replied. "The people with power didn't act. That's not your fault." Across the street, the council members argued quietly among themselves. They were already thinking about their reputations, investigations, lawsuits, and political damage. But the people watching them no longer cared about their excuses. Their trust in their leaders had cracked just like the cliff, deeply, completely, maybe beyond repair. Late at night, the families of the man who had fallen arrived. Their cries were heartbreaking. The sound cut through the town like lightning. Eleanor felt her chest tighten painfully as she watched them. The council members tried to offer condolences, but the family refused to speak to them. One of the grieving relatives turned toward the officials and said, "He died because you didn't listen." No official had a response. The next morning, emergency crews returned with better equipment. Divers searched again, and the Coast Guard scanned the area, but the chances were slim. The town stood on the edge, watching silently, united in grief and anger. Meetings were held, investigations launched, and blame began to bounce between government departments, maintenance teams, and budget committees. Everyone pointed fingers at someone else, but the people in the town did not forget who had been warned first and who had ignored those warnings for days. The atmosphere stayed heavy. Schools closed, businesses paused, and people walked around with hollow expressions. Some visited the site with flowers, leaving them near the newly built barrier. Others stood and stared, trying to understand how something so terrible could happen in a place they considered safe. The council called a formal meeting, opening it to the public. It was the most crowded meeting the town had ever seen. Voices rose. Questions were thrown. Accusations echoed through the hall. Eleanor sat near the front, silent but firm. Every complaint made the officials shrink a little more. They could no longer hide behind words. The people wanted accountability, action, and change, not apologies. Eleanor finally stood up during the meeting. The room fell silent. She looked at the officials and said softly, "This wasn't just a collapse. This was a failure of responsibility. You lost our trust, and trust is not something humans easily forgive." The officials had no answer. Her words hung in the air long after the meeting ended. From that day forward, the council was forced to take real action. Safety protocols were rewritten, dangerous areas were inspected, and the cliffside was permanently closed. But these changes came too late to save the man who had fallen. And as the town moved through its grief, one truth became clear: ignoring warnings comes with a price, and sometimes that price is a life that can never be replaced. The town would change, the rules would change, but the memory of being ignored and the devastation that followed would stay forever. In the weeks after the collapse, the town felt like a different world. The quiet streets, the little shops, the familiar faces, everything was still there. But something inside the community had changed forever. People spoke more softly, walked more slowly, and looked at the cliff with a mixture of sadness and fear. The sound of the ocean, once peaceful, now reminded everyone of the day it swallowed a life right before their eyes. The town was alive, but it carried a deep wound that wouldn't heal easily. Eleanor felt this change more than anyone. She still walked every morning, but she no longer went to the cliffside road. That place felt too heavy for her heart. Instead, she sat on a bench overlooking the sea from a safer distance. She watched the waves crash against the rocks, remembering the days when she used to admire them without fear. Now, every wave felt like a warning, a memory, a reminder of how fragile everything truly was. People in the town had begun treating Eleanor differently. Before, many saw her as an overly cautious woman who worried too much. Now, they approached her with respect, even guilt. Some apologized to her, others simply sat beside her in silence, sharing the pain without words. She appreciated their kindness, but their apologies didn't erase the memory of the man's terrified face as the ground beneath him vanished. She wished she had been able to do more, to stop him, to stop the disaster. But the truth followed her everywhere. She had done everything one person could do. The town council, on the other hand, found themselves facing a storm of questions and consequences. Reporters continued visiting. Investigations dug through their decisions, budgets, and ignored warnings. Some officials resigned. Others tried to defend themselves, but their words only made people angrier. The trust that once held the community together had been shattered, and rebuilding it felt almost impossible. Meetings were held every few days. People demanded safety checks in every risky area, not just the cliff. They demanded transparency, responsibility, and action. And for the first time in a long time, the officials had no choice but to listen. They sent engineers to inspect the coastline, the old bridges, the hiking paths, places they had ignored for years. Warning signs were placed, barriers were strengthened, and new rules were written. But no matter how many improvements were made, the feeling of loss never left the town. One morning, Eleanor decided to visit the site again. She had avoided it since the day of the collapse, but something inside her said it was time. She walked slowly, nervous with each step, until she reached the new metal fence the town had installed. Behind it, the collapsed area stretched out like a giant scar, deep, uneven, and haunting. What used to be a road was now a jagged cliff edge covered in mud and broken stone. The sea below still churned, restless and unforgiving. She stood there quietly, her heart heavy. After a few minutes, she heard footsteps behind her. It was Thomas, the retired engineer. He gave her a gentle nod and joined her at the fence. "It looks different every time I see it," he said softly. Eleanor nodded. "It will never be the same." They stood together, listening to the waves. The wind brushed against their coats, carrying the scent of salt and memories. Thomas placed a hand on the fence. "The town is finally doing what should have been done long ago. Safety teams, new rules, regular inspections. It took them too long, but at least they are learning." Eleanor sighed. "But it costs a life." "Yes," Thomas said quietly, "and that's something they will have to carry forever." More people arrived at the site over the next weeks. Some came to leave flowers. Some came to stare in silence. Others brought their children, pointing at the collapsed edge and saying softly, "This is why we must listen when someone warns us." It became not just a memorial but a lesson carved into the land. Months passed. The weather warmed. Tourists began returning, though fewer than before. The town felt slightly lighter, but it still held on to the memory of that terrible day. The council organized a community gathering to discuss rebuilding not the road, but trust. They invited everyone, including Eleanor. When she arrived, people greeted her with warm smiles and gentle words. She sat in the front row, unsure of how she felt. She didn't want praise or recognition. She only wanted the town to be safe. The council began the meeting with a public apology. Their voices shook as they admitted they had been wrong about the cliff, about ignoring warnings, about choosing convenience over safety. Their words didn't erase the past, but hearing them spoken aloud brought a quiet, bittersweet relief to the room. Then Eleanor was invited to speak. She stood slowly, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice was steady. "I never wanted to be right," she began. "I only wanted our town to be safe. Warnings are not meant to scare people. They are meant to protect them. When someone tells you something is dangerous, listen even if it doesn't seem important at the time. We can rebuild roads, but we can't bring back a life." The room fell silent, every eye fixed on her. "We must be better," she continued, "for each other, for our future, for the man we lost." People nodded, some wiping tears, others clenching their hands with determination. After the meeting, several young parents approached her. They thanked her for being brave. They promised to teach their children to speak up when something seems wrong. Business owners promised to support safety improvements even if it meant losing a little money. The community had finally understood the value of a voice that speaks the truth even when it's inconvenient. Eleanor walked home that evening with a strange mix of sadness and hope. The street lamps glowed softly. The ocean roared in the distance. The town around her was still hurting, but it was also healing. Slowly, carefully, and together. One quiet evening, months after the tragedy, she returned to the memorial site alone. The wind was gentle that day, and the sea calmer than usual. She placed a small flower near the fence, whispered a prayer for the man who had fallen, and closed her eyes. She didn't forgive the council. She didn't forget what had happened. But she also didn't hold the anger like she once did. She knew that people make mistakes, sometimes terrible ones. What mattered now was that the town had opened its eyes. They had changed. They had learned. And they would never ignore warnings again. As Eleanor walked away, she looked back one last time at the broken cliff. It no longer felt like a symbol of failure. Instead, it felt like a reminder carved into the earth, a reminder of what happens when people refuse to listen, and what can happen when a community finally learns to care. The town would carry the lesson forever. And Eleanor, though still sad, knew one thing for certain. Her voice had mattered, even if it had taken tragedy for people to hear it.